This year, we commemorated 50 years of national service, and much like the turbulent circumstances of our independence, national service was something that we had to embark upon out of necessity. At the time of separation, Singapore was faced with a host of threats, including confrontasi with Indonesia, insurgency from the Malayan Communist Party, and communal violence. Now, the British forces remained to provide security, but in 1967, briefly 3 years after independence, the British forces also announced their withdrawal. The Enlistment Act was passed in 1967, at a time when it was clear that Singapore had a very short window of time to build up its own defense forces. At this time, Singapore had very little in way of financial resources and a booming population following the post-war baby boom. Now, it has been 50 years since the Enlistment Act was passed, and there have been many changes in Singapore. Our security threats and our approach to national service have evolved with this. In 2013, the Committee to Strengthen National Service started an extensive consultation process with a steering committee led by Defense Minister Dr. Ng Eng Hen, and 2 working groups focusing on support for national service and recognition and benefits of national service. The focus of this committee was to ensure that support for NS remained strong in the population and that NS men, employers, and family members all have a shared sense of duty for their part in this process. The CSNS committee came up with detailed recommendations which have been swiftly implemented, and NS men have felt the impact. The focus of this committee was to improve the lives of NS men and to make compliance with NS obligations easier for all stakeholders without compromising training needs. A difficult balance indeed that has required thoughtful, well-calibrated policies. The NS50 events from July to September were particularly moving, with the theme From My Generation to Yours, bringing together earlier and current generations of NS men. I think Prime Minister Lee himself made a moving speech at the final event last week, sharing his own experiences in the Army and ending with the importance of passing the NS torch from his generation to the subsequent ones. Now, national service is an important rite of passage for us, and I'm heartened that many understand and appreciate its importance. Now, my main interest in this motion is to understand how NS will fit into the future roles the military will be required to perform and the constraints we face. Now, traditionally, national service is largely involved starting in the military, and with the majority of the cohort going through a basic military training that is modeled on infantry training. Now, this shared experience is an important part of the bonding NS men feel intuitively when we meet one another. We all have the same experience going through basic military training, dealing with NS sergeants, and the same thing that we laugh about when we watch Our Boys to Men. Yet, is this largely infantry-based training model appropriate for national service in the coming years, particularly with the changing nature of warfare and the security threats we face? The first is military technology, which improves at a tremendous pace. New inventions can render previous methods of warfare OTOs. One vivid example is the use of drones in warfare. Now, a BBC story on a US drone pilot was eye-opening. The drone pilot, for example, could have breakfast at home, send his daughter to school, then go to a drone control center a short drive from home, and pilot a drone based thousands of miles away in the Middle East. It will be office hours for him, but nighttime in the country of operations. The precision of such technology allows the pilot to see the targets clearly at night, attack with precision, and take photographs after the damage has been inflicted. After a day of fighting, which would still be office hours for the drone pilot, they could go back home at night, have dinner with their families. Now, it sounds like a very simple life, yet even drone fight pilots go through a very high incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. So they too seem to face the psychological stresses that other combatants face. Now, aerial drone warfare is just one component of increasingly automated forms of warfare, although it is probably the one that captures the imagination most readily. At the recent NS Pride Day Awards, I was quite happy to see that even our own national servicemen had found numerous uses of drone technology, and I assume that because this is the NS Pride Day Awards, it is in the public domain. So, for example, drones are used in naval operations. They're used for surveillance, intelligence gathering. In the Army, they can also be used for reconnaissance operations, for security patrolling, all of these things which used to be done by infantrymen who had to face the danger of enemy fire. However, would this rapid use of technology make it, first of all, difficult for national servicemen to catch up? And secondly, how relevant would it make a largely infantry-based army if every few years the technology that these infantrymen have to deal with changes at a very rapid pace? Will our national servicemen be able to keep up with these increasingly advanced forms of warfare? And how will dealing with automated warfare be built into the drills our national servicemen go through, perhaps either in lieu of or maybe in addition to the old fieldcraft skills we learned? The second type of threats I think we have to prepare for is on the other end of the technology spectrum. These are the threats posed by terror. Now, the difference between terror and conventional warfare is conventional warfare, of course, if you comply with the rules of war, is a military-on-military exercise. Civilian populations are not, at least in theory, meant to be targeted. On the other hand, terrorists have complete disregard for this principle. Their primary aim is to attack civilian populations, to cause as much damage as possible. They target highly populated areas like train stations, airports, hotels, and even gatherings. They don't require very sophisticated technology. Basic weapons, guns, makeshift bombs, or sometimes even vehicles can be used to carry out terror attacks. In this respect, these threats are much more difficult to identify and to prepare for. Yet, as these threats become a much larger phase, the types of threats we face, would we see a larger role for national servicemen in dealing with these new types of threats? The final aspect I'd like to deal with is how we deal with the limitations and constraints. Now, this is a constant theme that I think the ministry has dealt with over the years. In the early days of national service, we had a population boom with high unemployment. So pulling people into national service did not have as big an economic impact. Nowadays, there are strict limits being imposed on limitation. Cohort sizes are falling. So MINDEF will have to be able to make do with a much smaller population. At the same time, MINDEF's available training spaces are also getting reduced due to competing needs for land in land-scarce Singapore. Now, I've been quite impressed by MINDEF's efforts at working around these constraints. Personally, I've experienced it myself. As an infantryman, I did my basic training. I learned, the old M16 rifle, and I barely passed my shooting tests. I think I've shared in this house how the SAR-21 doubled my productivity. I managed to get a marksman at the first time I tried. The range I used was also a multi-story rifle range, so that meant you could have many more times the number of people doing the training. So this seems to be MINDEF's way of adapting. You use better technology to get the same outcomes by using less land and less resources. But while these are admirable adaptations, which basically is your classic productivity improvement, you're getting more out of less, would we be able to achieve better outcomes by changing the game altogether? For example, if we are looking at a phase of warfare where you do not need very large amounts of manpower to fight wars or to man aircrafts, do we need different forms of training altogether, which would significantly change the type of training areas we need and the type of people we need to have trained? In this motion, I was hoping to raise broad themes to give the ministry a platform to basically share the vision of national service, perhaps for the next 50 years, even as we move forward the first 50 with strong support from our population. Thank you. Thank you, Speaker.